Edward Talbot, with the active encouragement and participation of his wife Lavinia, founded Lady Margaret Hall. It was their initiative. Edward chaired and Lavinia served on the founding committee of LMH and then the council that succeeded it for many years. They guided and supported LMH and maintained a lifelong interest in its welfare. LMH has always dated its foundation not to October 1879, when the first small group of women students took up residence at the northeast end of Norham Gardens, but to a meeting chaired by Edward Talbot here in the Warden's Lodgings, Keble, on the 4th of June 1878, at which the decision to go ahead was taken. We have Edward Talbot's own retrospective account of how it all came about. In 1923, at the time of the 45th anniversary of LMH's foundation, he wrote the following brief account of a conversation he had with Lavinia in 1878. The movement for admitting women to educational advantages within the universities was already on foot, and at this time Mrs. Talbot and I paid a visit to Cambridge and went outside to Girton College. We were impressed by what we saw and felt that here was a form of new development in education which was bound to expand. I remember saying to my wife, why should the church not, for once, be at the front instead of behind in its development? We came back to Oxford with this thought in our minds of starting a small residentiary enterprise for which I suppose Hall was the natural world. One sees immediately the crucial juncture for the Talbots and for LMH of two causes: the promotion of higher education for women and the promotion of religion, more specifically the Church of England, and to some extent the high church tradition within it. Oxford University played no direct institutional role in the foundation of LMH, nor did the Church of England. But the foundation was made by the Talbots and a group of like-minded, senior high church figures in Oxford, for all of whom the religious purpose was at least as important as the educational one. As Edward Talbot put it in a letter in 1884, they wanted, quote, a Keble in this sort of education, that is, women's education. Now, it was inevitable by the late 1870s that the possibility of higher education for women at Oxford was being discussed. Girton College and Cambridge had been founded a decade earlier, in 1869, followed by Newnham in 1871. University College London admitted women students for the first time in 1869. Oxford was lagging behind. Important changes were also taking place in girls' secondary education. The early foundations in mid-century of Queen's College, Harley Street, 1848, North London Collegiate, 1850, Cheltenham Ladies' College, 1854, were followed later by the establishment of the Girls' Public Day School Company in 1872, which among its activities opened Oxford Girls' High School in 1875. And when a Government Schools Inquiry Commission of 1864-7 criticised the lack of educational provision beyond elementary level for middle-class girls, the government took decisive action. The bold Endowed Schools Act of 1869 authorised the use of endowments of boys' schools to found girls' grammar schools up and down the country. In this way, a supply chain of academically qualified girls was beginning to emerge, and the growing number of secondary schools for girls needed women teachers with higher education. It's therefore hardly surprising that change was afoot, if a bit belatedly, in Oxford. As we've heard, some courses of lectures for women were set up in the 1870s by a group of female volunteers. These were not university lectures, but privately organised extramural lectures given for women only by some volunteer professors and tutors. They were enthusiastically attended by many women, especially here in North Oxford. On another front, Oxford local examinations had been open to girls as well as boys in 1867. And in 1875, a huge further step was taken when the Oxford delegates for local examinations were allowed to create special, higher-level examinations for women that were designed to be of a similar standard to Oxford University final examinations. Because women were extremely unlikely to have had the opportunity to study classical languages, Latin and Greek were not compulsory elements in these examinations, and entirely new examinations in English and modern languages were created for women only. These were subjects that did not exist at the time in the curricula for Oxford undergraduates, all male, of course. Bit by bit, then, on the fringes of the university, these various initiatives were gradually creating the possibility of women studying for degree-level examinations. Many Oxford academics loathed these developments, sometimes loathed them quite loudly, and claimed they would have all sorts of deleterious effects on the women themselves and on Oxford, while all supporters of women's higher education at Oxford, of course, welcomed them. However, by 1877, 1878, attention was also turning to the need for residential accommodation for young women while they studied, and the proposed residential accommodation and community inevitably raised questions of ethos and culture. Allies on the issue of gender split apart on the issue of religion, which proved to be a gulf that could not be bridged. On the one hand, the Church Party, including, of course, the Talbots, wished to have a foundation on the principles of the Church of England. But this was unacceptable to others, including the philosopher T.H. Green, who were convinced it must have no denominational affiliation. The meeting at Keble on the 4th of June, 1878, was convened for the consideration of questions connected with the higher education of women. Its decisions were unambiguous. Here is the record of the resolutions that were agreed. They're also very businesslike. One, that it is desirable to attempt the establishment in Oxford of a small hall or hostel in connection with the Church of England for the reception of women desirous of availing themselves of the special advantages which Oxford offers for higher education. And then the logistics. A committee of 8, with power to add to their number, was immediately to be established. And then, in an acknowledgement of what else was going on around this initiative, this committee was to have the power to cooperate with any other groups that might be suitable and necessary to attain their aims. So the Committee of 8 was duly elected immediately. 4 members were women, including Lavinia Talbot. The 4 men were all senior academics, including 2 heads of house, Talbot of Keble, H.D. Harper of Jesus, and the Regius Professor of Pastoral Theology, E. King. These 3 were all clergymen in the Church of England. It was also resolved to invite the Bishop of Oxford to be patron of this scheme, which he agreed to do. And just 3 days later, with some new members added, Edward Talbot was elected chairman. The pronounced Church of England character of the proposed hall was not acceptable to many supporters of women's education in Oxford. One of the women members of the founding committee, Bertha Johnson, later explained how the original intention in June 1878 was that the proposed college should be Church of England, but as wide as possible, not representing any one party in the church. Efforts were made by Talbot's committee to broaden the project even further to keep open the possibility of unity and one foundation. On the 23rd of October 1878, the committee confirmed a hard-won compromise, stating that the proposed hall would follow, I quote, the distinct principles of the Church of England, but carefully not saying that students must be members of the Church of England, and indeed instead allowing that others were not disqualified from membership. You can almost feel the tension in the wording. Others not disqualified. In this, it differed from Keble and ran counter to Edward Talbot's own personal preference. A fundraising circular issued just after this decision was taken chose somewhat more positive language, describing the new foundation as an academical house on the principles of the Church of England with provision for the liberty of members of other religious bodies. Difficult though this compromise was, some members of the committee resigned rather than accept it. It was not enough. Plans for a second hall continued, and a committee was eventually set up on the 7th of February 1879 to go ahead and establish a hall for women in which no distinction will be made between students on the ground of their belonging to different religious denominations. This non-denominational liberal Christian hall became Somerville, and the Church of England Hall became LMH. Almost immediately after the decision was taken to establish a non-denominational hall, the LMH committee, at its meeting of the 6th of March 1879, deputed Lavinia Talbot and Bertha Johnson to meet representatives of the other hall. This was an important step in establishing good relations where they might have been strained. LMH and Somerville both welcomed their first students in October 1879. At the beginning, a hall or halls for women were planned as residences, but not direct providers of formal education, which in the absence of qualified women clearly had to come from male academics. Recognizing this reality, agreement had been reached by all parties in the middle of June, in the 22nd of June 1878, to set up the Association for Promoting the Higher Education of Women, always known as the AEW, to organise separate lectures for women students on AEW premises, to make arrangements for women to attend the lectures given for male undergraduates by tutors who were willing to allow the women in, not all were, and to arrange classes and tutorials, similarly with willing male academics. The LMH committee lost no time in preparing the new church foundation. An accommodation subcommittee started work at the end of October 1878, charged with funding and furnishing a property. Lavinia Talbot was particularly active in searching for a suitable property as inexpensive as possible. It had to be inexpensive. There was no financial endowment to support the new venture. The purchase of 21 Norham Gardens, which Edward Talbot later described as the little ugly white villa, was agreed in April 1879. Lavinia then worked extremely hard with fellow committee members, Bertha Johnson and Miss Millman, to furnish and equip the house with the utmost frugality. They congratulated themselves on how little money they spent. Edward Talbot, meanwhile, offered with the principle of Jesus to be guarantors for the house purchase price of £3,000, while urgent appeals for funds were circulated. In these very practical ways, the Talbots played a crucial role in bringing LMH into being. A particular source of satisfaction for Edward Talbot was the appointment of Elizabeth Wordsworth as the first principal of LMH. Her appointment was, in fact, largely owed to him. Edward Talbot had been a good friend of Elizabeth Wordsworth's brother John from the time they were undergraduates in Oxford, Edward at Christ Church, John at New College. In 1870, the same year in which Edward married Lavinia and took up residence in Keble, John Wordsworth also married and came to live with his wife Esther in a new house in Keble Terrace, now Keble Road. Elizabeth Wordsworth often came to stay with them and also saw a good deal of the Talbots. Indeed, she had been present at the opening ceremony of Keble College in the summer of 1870, after attending Ensenia the previous day to see her father receive an honorary degree. Her father, Christopher, was then Bishop of Lincoln, and her brother John, at that time a tutor at Brasenose, was later Bishop of Salisbury. This branch of the Wordsworth family were distinguished, scholarly, devout, high church people. William Wordsworth, by the way, was Elizabeth's great-uncle. Elizabeth herself was very well read, with extensive knowledge of Latin, Greek, Hebrew, French, German, and Italian. Edward Talbot wrote to her on the 18th of November 1878 to invite her to become the first principal of the church hall. 2 days later, she was elected by the committee, even before her acceptance had been received. On the 21st of November, Edward wrote to congratulate both her and the committee on her appointment, describing her as just the person to give the new foundation the tone we desire, as at once an educational scheme of the most thorough and literal kind, and a work for the church and its members. Elizabeth's only reservation about accepting was that she did not approve of the decision that non-Anglican students might be admitted. Edward reassured her that a non-denominational hall, that is, Somerville, was also being planned, and therefore nonconformists were very unlikely to apply to the church hall. It was Elizabeth, by the way, who proposed in April 1879 that the church hall should be named in honour of Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, who was an important patron of learning, including significant bequests from her to the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, and she was also a very devout woman. After the heroic efforts of 1878 and 1879, Edward and Lavinia Talbot remained actively involved in the governance of LMH. Even when Edward was appointed Vicar of Leeds in 1888, he continued as chairman of the LMH Council, although he was rarely able to attend. At his last regular meeting as chairman, on the 29th of November 1888, the committee expressed, quote, their deep sense of the debt of gratitude that the hall owes to the warden for his conduct as chairman of the committee since the foundation of the hall, and to Mrs. Talbot for the great interest she's always taken in promoting its welfare. Finally, on his appointment as Bishop of Rochester in 1895, Talbot resigned the chairmanship and was given the honorary title of Warden of LMH in recognition of his unique role in founding and guiding it. Even then, he and Lavinia remained members of the council, though largely absent. LMH, like Somerville, soon began to develop the characteristics of a college rather than just a residential hall. In fact, Somerville decided to call itself Somerville College as early as 1894. LMH erected buildings much more impressive than the first ugly white villa, and when it was possible, began to appoint its own women tutors. Well before Oxford University first formally recognised the existence of women students by establishing the Delegacy for Women Students in 1910, it was obvious that LMH was a college for women in Oxford. LMH received its royal charter, recognising it as such, in 1926. We know that Edward and Lavinia Talbot rejoiced in an institutional growth far greater than they had anticipated. 40 years after the opening of LMH, at a commemoration service on the 18th of October 1919, Edward Talbot, now Bishop of Winchester, gave the address. So this is quite a long quotation. It's never easy to be really thankful, but we have cause. It was such a slender, puny beginning. A shabby little villa. He really did not like that house. A shabby little villa out of the way at the far end of Oxford life, no public buildings, some half dozen rising to 20 students, a few £100 of capital, and these largely borrowed, a start not too kindly viewed by some even of those who were ready for a new venture, and by others whose support would have been most valued, regarded as a dangerous freak. That was the beginning. And now, our buildings, our numbers, the gathered loyalty of 10 generations, which has brought us together here, how little we foresaw it or could have reckoned on it, how much and how happy it is. It's Edward Talbot in 1919. Of the buildings, much the most imposing was Talbot Building, opened in 1910, and still the most instantly recognisable face of LMH. It's one of 4 buildings designed by Reginald Blomfield from the mid-1890s to the mid-1920s that established LMH's architectural character. Talbot Building included a proper dining hall, Talbot Hall, and a proper library, both of which are now rather grand meeting rooms. The Talbot dedication is most appropriate, and just recently, LMH has renamed 2 seminar rooms that flank Talbot Hall in this building as the Lavinia Talbot Room and the Littleton Room, to ensure that Lavinia's role is not forgotten. Edward Talbot was invited by LMH to dedicate its new chapel, designed by Giles Gilbert Scott, in January 1933, just a year before his death. Already in his commemorative address in 1919, he had spoken of his hope to see a chapel built at LMH. When he accepted the invitation, he wrote, "Surely nothing over which I have control shall keep me, us, away." I think that was a reference to his age and perhaps not feeling very well. The order of service of the dedication of the chapel rightly described Edward Talbot as founder of the hall. Bishop Talbot duly dedicated the chapel, which must have given him great satisfaction. Formal bidding prayers were then read by the Bishop of Oxford, following the pattern still used at university sermons. Prayers for the church, the sovereign and royal family, the university and LMH came first. Then thanks for founders and benefactors. I quote, "Among whom shall especially be mentioned Edward Stewart Talbot, Bishop, and Lavinia, his wife, who are with us still. They came first on the list, and jointly and rightly so. In 1933, Edward and Lavinia Talbot had been associated with LMH for 55 years. Thank you.